Hello, Bill, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us to kick off this panel on carbon markets. You are, of course, chairman of TSVCM and group CEO of Standard Chartered, who provides capital to many businesses around the world that are currently thinking about, or in fact have embarked upon, their transition to net zero. So thank you. My first question to you concerns the final recommendations from the Taskforce on how to strengthen and scale voluntary carbon markets that were recently published. So for you, what do you consider to be the most important next steps in terms of translating those recommendations into real action?
Yeah, in many ways, the most critical next step is a previous step, which is for, if you look at our report, what we say right up front is, number one has to be corporations reducing their emissions to the greatest extent possible. Second is reporting the emissions along the way. And third is using offsets to help to deal with those hard to abate sectors or the rump. So the most important thing is that companies actually articulate quite specifically what their net zero commitment is, publish their plan for how they intend to do that, in addition to how they're going to report that. And there's some really thorny questions around reporting, not least in the financial services sector. I mean, what is our emission profile that comes from a steel mill or a steel company that we finance? This financed emissions question is very thorny. But the most important thing is to solidify the net zero commitments. In terms of the carbon market specifically, it's getting agreement on what we've called the core carbon principles. And we made recommendations in the report. We're carrying on. So the task force issued its final report in January, but we're going to issue a second final report in July because we're taking this effort to the next stage. And the thorny question of what gets included and what doesn't. And what we're determined to do is to have a very high quality set of criteria to avoid any of the accusations of greenwashing that have characterized the carbon offset market historically. And we think that there's a critical role for the carbon market to play, and having a super high quality agreed set of criteria for inclusion in those core carbon contracts is the most important step from here.
Thank you. So precisely on this point of greenwashing, so carbon offsetting is obviously not without its critics. And one area of concern is that carbon markets could de-incentivize companies from taking the necessary action to address their own greenhouse gas emissions. So what specifically in the task force's recommendations addresses these concerns?
So I think people that are making net zero commitments are doing so because pressure from their own stakeholders. Now, in many cases, the stakeholders are themselves, the board or the employees. But in many cases, also it's the owners. And the owners are becoming more and more vocal. So on our task force, we have a number of the largest investors in the world, in addition to the two of the big investor consortia, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, for example, which represents $50 trillion of AUM or something like that. And they've got a very specific set of criteria for the companies that they have in their portfolio. They want a net zero plan. They also want to see evidence of progress, specifically by 2030, because we know that doing all of your good work in the last 10 years of this 30-year period will not get us there. We have to do actually the heavy lifting in the first 10 years of that period, which can really only be done through substantial reductions, can only be done economically. So we have to have the focus on reduction outright first. And I think the stakeholders are pressuring for exactly that. So I'm not too worried that the offset market is going to be used excessively as a way to avoid doing what you have to do fundamentally. But we also know that the price of the carbon offsets is critically important. And if you look at some of the contracts that exist in the world today, the price of carbon per ton is down in $2 or $2.75, which no one thinks is the right price to get to that answer of a net zero planet by 2050. If you look at the European emission trading scheme, which is now trading at 45 or so dollars a ton, that feels a little bit closer to what's appropriate. And if you ask Bill Gates what the right price is, he might say $200 a ton, because that's what it costs on the margin to get this stuff out of the atmosphere in a permanent way, so permanently sequestered. So part of the key to shifting of ensuring that we don't have companies that are over relying on offsets is to get the price up. And the way to get the price up is to set a very high quality threshold for what's a qualifying contract. And in order to have a high quality emission reduction, it's going to be more expensive. And that will give a pretty big incentive for people to reduce their own emissions rather than relying on the offset market.
Great, that does make a lot of sense. So on a somewhat unrelated topic, COP26 is happening later this year. So what role do the COP26 negotiations play in the voluntary carbon market? And what for you would be a good outcome to the COP26 negotiations?
Yeah, so technically the COP26 negotiations, so in particular, I think some of the thorny issues around Article 6 and the like, don't influence the voluntary carbon market at all, because what we've said is we want to have, well, as the name suggests, a voluntary market that is neither dependent on nor being led by nor leading, not that we could, the compliance markets, which inevitably is what governments negotiate when it comes to rule setting. So we've not offered views on what governments should be discussing, much less what the outcome should be. What we've said is we want to have a high quality carbon market that's voluntary, where the participants are participating because they think it's the right thing to do in terms of funneling money from the net zero committers into the hands of people that can actually get the carbon out of the environment. And ideally, if we're successful, we'll be talking about moving tens of billions, or eventually hundreds of billions of dollars of desperately needed funding into those areas where that funding is most needed, whether that's into developing markets where there's an enormous financing gap, 90% of the required financing is not available, or into breakthrough technologies that need the investment up front in order to achieve the scale to make those strategies, whether it's hydrogen or direct air capture or things of that nature, to make them economically viable. So that's the voluntary market. The compliance markets have a critical role to play. And if governments take some extraordinary steps to reach global agreement on how carbon reduction projects are going to be assessed or qualified, the voluntary market will no doubt will operate within whatever rules are set or around. They should be highly complementary because at the end of the day, we'll have a set of requirements coming from government in whatever form they come, along with an accounting system, and then a set of undertakings that private enterprises are taking up that are all going in the same direction, which is getting the planet to net zero by 2050 with material progress by 2030. We really have to start today, or at least pick up the pace today. And thankfully, we're all aligned on that.
Great, thank you. So just one final question. This panel is aimed at non-executive directors. So what advice would you have for non-executive directors that are just starting out on their carbon offsetting journey? I
think the non-execs have a critical role to play because, of course, in many ways, they are the intermediaries between the owners and other stakeholders and the management of the companies. Management has inevitable pressures on hitting earnings targets and P&L, and I'll say not just pressures, but also distractions. The non-execs can insist, and in fact, will be under pressure to insist that the net zero transition plans that their companies are undertaking are credible, that they're verifiable, that they're consistent with the company strategy. I think this is a classic case of a need for the board of directors of a company to take the medium and long-term view to complement the inevitable pull towards shorter-term views that come from a management team, in particular in something as difficult as a net zero transition.